Everyone, you all know me, so I've neglected to ask someone to introduce me, but I don't think it's needed. Yeah. It's great to be here with you guys. I wanted to provide a little trailer for the course that I'm teaching next semester to try to encourage you guys to consider enrolling in it. It's an online course. For those of you who are residential, you might want to use your 36 units to be in a classroom with everyone. I get that. But the online environment, some of you are in my class this semester, there's a lot that becomes possible there that might not be possible in the classroom. So consider it. The course I'm teaching is called Process and Difference in the Pluriverse. And while this semester I'm teaching Alfred North Whitehead and the cosmological perspective that he articulated as it relates to the natural sciences, relativity theory, quantum theory, complexity theory, evolutionary theory, and so on. Next semester in the spring, I'm applying Whitehead and process relational philosophy to politics, to sociology, and to ethics. So moving from something more metaphysical and abstract into something that I hope is more directly relevant to the challenges that we face as a human community, as a society, but a society not just as humans, not just of humans, but a society that includes various forms of non-human life and even non-living, as we traditionally understand life, non-living agencies. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Whitehead, I want to unpack what he means by a process relational ontology, or a process relational view of reality, and then from there lead into how this applies to politics. So process is pointing to the way that reality is in some sense unfinished. Reality is in some sense always unfolding. I'm kind of exemplifying that now with this talk. I didn't have enough time to prepare something. So it's incomplete, it's unfinished. I'm discovering it as we go, okay? But that's the nature of the universe that we live in. Whitehead had a debate with Einstein about whether or not space-time was some eternal finished whole, so-called block universe. Einstein didn't like quantum theory because it implied that there's some indeterminacy. Whitehead loved that because his universe is creative. The future does not already exist out there in a fourth dimension of time. The future is radically open. It's, in some sense, shaped by what has occurred in the past, but nothing that occurs in the past determines what will happen in the future. So process points to this open-ended creativity. I like to refer to not reality, but creality. The relational side is the way that I think most of us in this room understand and try to live out. It's the way that everything is interconnected. Everything is in relationship to everything else, such that to be who I am is composed of relationships to others. I was just watching Cloud Atlas last night, and there's this great line that was in the novel that the movie's based on. Daniel Mitchell was the author. The idea is that our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we belong to others. So this is true at the level of human beings, the way that our personalities and our psyches are formed through relationship. Initially to the mother, to our mother. We learn how to be in relationship and to form attachment to the first other, our mother, right? And then we learn through that initial mirroring how to be in relationship to others. And we often carry wounds in these relationships. And so it's important when we talk about how everything is interconnected, not to think that that is just, you know, a rosy sort of kumbaya vision of the world, because these connections often break. Everything is connected, but as another pluralist process philosopher, William James, says, everything is connected in a strung along way. Everything is connected in a mediated way, in other words. Kind of drawing on what Adam was talking about with media theory. So I may not be directly related to you know, a newborn infant in Delhi, but there might be a few degrees of separation whereby I am connected to that person. Not immediately, but mediated, in a mediated way. And Whitehead's a process relational thinker who's also a pluralistic thinker, and that already slipped this word pluralism, which is in the title of my course. And pluralism is an idea that I'm getting from William James, and this is one of the last, it's a book published based on the last lecture, one of the last major lectures that William James gave before he died the lecture was in 1909. And just to give you a sense for what pluralism means, and I mean pluralism in an ontological sense, pluralism in the sense that reality is multiple, not just that we have a variety of ways of perceiving reality, or that we have a variety of perspectives on reality, but that reality is out there and one, and we just look at it from different points of view. I mean that reality itself is plural. This is what James says about that. He says, what at bottom is meant by calling the universe many, or by calling it one? He says, pragmatically interpreted, things are with one another in many ways, but nothing includes everything, or dominates over everything. The word and trails along after every sentence. Something always escapes. Ever not quite has to be said of the best attempts made anywhere in the universe at attaining all-inclusiveness. The pluralistic world is thus more like a federal republic than an empire or a kingdom. And then in contrast to pluralism, monism, he says, insists that when you come down to reality as such, to the reality of realities, everything is present to everything else in one vast, instantaneous, co-implicated completeness. Nothing can, in any sense, functional or substantial, be really absent from anything else. All things interpenetrate and telescope together in the one great total conflux. So in this lecture, James is contrasting what he will refer to variously as monism or idealism, absolute idealism, to pluralism. And pluralism is kind of his in-between position between monism or idealism on the one hand and materialism or reductionism on the other hand. You could say that it's an alternative to dualism, Cartesian dualism, where you have mind and matter, two different kinds of realities, and an alternative to monism where it's just matter or it's just mind, depending whether you're a Hegelian who says everything is ultimately a perspective within the mind of God unfolding through history, or you're a materialist who says everything is really just matter in motion and what we call mind is sort of an epiphenomenal appearance. Pluralism tries to find a middle path between these two, and basically is suggesting a panpsychic view of things, so mind and matter are co-implicated all the way down, and that there isn't just one kind of thing or one way that reality is, and there's not two ways that reality is. There are an indefinite number of ways that reality can manifest. So reality, in other words, is made of perspectives. It's an ontological position. What does this look like in a social context, in a political context? Well, building on some contemporary Whiteheadian thinkers, in my course I'm going to try to engage us and welcome a conversation about how we can move beyond the contemporary stalemate where the old form of liberalism based on an idea of individualism, based on the idea of human beings as free agents who form a social contract to protect one another's rights as individuals, and that we as free human beings maintain and increase our freedom by dominating nature. Like, this is the modern picture. That liberal individualism is in many ways breaking down now, with the rise of this new form of conservatism, and even maybe not so new. It seems basically like the good old-fashioned fascism that we thought we had defeated. I'm using "we" here in a loose way. That's actually something I want to thematize in a second. But what ontological pluralism would mean if it were applied to a political, into the political arena, is that, if politics defined as the task that we're faced with as human beings of composing common worlds, we don't automatically inhabit the same world. And part of the issue with modern civilization, whether it's capitalistic or communist, is that there's an assumption that there's one reality out there. It's called nature, and science gives us access to it. And then we have multiple cultures that are sort of a superstructure on top of that one nature known by science. And the idea kind of like in the 90s was that if only we could agree to be open to other cultures, like multiculturalism, and if we all agreed in that context of multiple cultures that really there's this nature out there, and as science advances, it will allow us to master nature more and more, and provide human beings with more and more of the goods and services that we need, that would be the best that human beings could ever hope for. Right? We would achieve the liberation of human beings through the domination of nature. And this form of multiculturalism is, I think, it's failed, because the idea, I think, the presupposition was that, well, you can't really take your culture that seriously. It's just sort of the clothing that you drape on top of what is ultimately a biological process. We're just animals, and we can understand the brain through science as a sort of chemical factory, and we know the right way to fine-tune the chemistry of it with pharmaceuticals. And so the idea of multiculturalism as it was framed in the modern context was that you can't actually take your culture that seriously, because if you do, then you end up not having that underlying commitment to the unity of nature that would bind us all together. So there's a subtle way in which multiculturalism was presupposing a form of unity that's not really there. So what I'm proposing, building on thinkers like Bruno Latour, who's a contemporary French philosopher who's developed his own Gaian politics, is that instead of multiculturalism, which again presupposes a kind of mono-naturalism, that what we might want to try is a multinaturalism. In other words, nature or the universe is itself made of multiple perspectives. Human beings are one form of perspective that the universe has come to take upon itself, but that whatever form of world that we try to compose together as human beings, that's a task we have to achieve, and we can't presuppose that there's one world already there, and that if only we could all get with the program and accept science and accept climate change is real and accept the ecological crisis because science says it's real. That idea that there's one right perspective and that science has it and we just have to adopt it, I think, covers over the extent to which science is itself an open-ended process of inquiry. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's not as simple as just, I think there's this tendency on the left with what gets characterized as elitism to say, well, the people that don't agree with climate change being a problem, they're just stupid, and we just need to educate them, and if only we could educate them, they'd get that that's the truth and we need to do something about it. That strategy doesn't seem to be working. So I think we need to acknowledge that just the scientific perspective of a unified nature is not going to be enough to get us out of the crisis we're facing. It's obviously not going to be enough to just retreat into a sense of one particular culture being something that we can, retreat to, whether it's making America great again or whether it's any form of nationalism. There's a tendency to retreat from the multiculturalist project, which was to globalize culture through capitalism. And we do need to retreat from that. But how do we replace that form of multiculturalism with a deeper form of pluralism that's not just multicultural for humans, but pluralistic in the deeper sense that human beings recognize that we are one member of an Earth community, and that if we're going to compose a common world together, the we is not just human beings, right? We need a democracy of fellow creatures, which is a phrase that comes out of Whitehead's magnum opus, Process and Reality. He says, we find ourselves in a buzzing world amidst a democracy of fellow creatures. And for modern consciousness, that is an absolutely terrifying prospect, because it means that what we thought of as the free, autonomous, rational human ego is in fact a relational process embedded in an organism that is full of 10 times as much bacteria as human cells, and that's embedded in this ecosystem that's full of some scary stuff. There's a tendency in more spiritual orientations towards ecology, like deep ecologies say, to think that nature is this pristine, beautiful whole, and if only we could give up our sense of separation from it and reunite with Mother Nature, that everything would be great. But there were 5 mass extinctions prior to this one. Nature is creative, and there's a lot of destruction and annihilation in the evolutionary process that is often generative, but we don't want to be too Pollyanna about what it means to inhabit a more ecological consciousness. It's frightening, at least from the modern ego's perspective, to welcome in all of these other creatures into our democracy. So, how much time do I have? Another 10 minutes? 7 minutes? Okay. So let me just mention some of the books that we'd be reading in this course. I hope that sort of ramble through the process, relational, and pluralistic perspective made some sense. But so the first book that we're going to read in this course is by a thinker named Katherine Keller. And she's been thinking with Whitehead since the 80s. I think her first book was called From a Broken Web, Separation, Sexism, and Self, and we read a chapter from this in our Whitehead course this semester. So she's using Whitehead's process relational philosophy and applying it to gender politics, and showing how Whitehead's perspective can provide not just a new political orientation, but it can ground that new political orientation in an ontology that is in contrast to the patriarchal ontology that has guided Western philosophy for 2,500 years. So her work is very deep. In the book that we're reading, which is called, I think it might not be her most recent book. She pumps them out at an unbelievable rate. It's called Cloud of the Impossible, Negative Theology and Planetary Entanglement. She engages with Judith Butler, famous feminist, and shows how Butler, through Butler's engagement with Whitehead, has moved away from a sort of more social constructionist point of view on gender to begin incorporating a form of constructivism that's ontological, that reality itself is an ongoing process of construction, not just human society. So whereas most postmodern, post-structuralist thinkers have tended to shun metaphysics as a source of violence, Whitehead's metaphysics is providing an alternative way of doing metaphysics that is more relational, more open to the multifariousness and the queerness of the world. And Keller will engage with Butler and show how Whitehead is expanding the potential for these radical political movements, particularly around issues of gender equity and feminism. We'll also read Donna Haraway, another Whiteheadian philosopher. Her new book is called Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulucene. And in this book, it's just Haraway being Haraway. She's such a playful, creative thinker. It's full of puns, her writing, and jokes, and seriousness. Staying with the trouble is her way of not shying away from getting entangled in the messiness and the uncertainty of our situation. Not claiming to have a clear answer, but more trying to grope and feel her way towards an orientation that includes non-humans, again, in our democracy and in our society, expanding our sense of society to include relations with all creatures. We're also going to read Timothy Morton's new book called Humankind, Solidarity with Non-Human People, where Morton is basically taking Marx and communist theory and trying to extend it beyond its anthropocentric orientation to, again, include non-humans within the community. And Morton he's such a delight to read. He's pretty zany, actually, and he makes some off-the-wall comments. And he comes out of literary theory, and now he's doing philosophy. And he's a really provocative writer, and I think that you guys will enjoy what he has to say. He's a serious thinker too, and I think the way that he's trying to take up Marxism again and point out its flaws, but there's a lot of important critique that we don't want to lose despite the anthropocentrism. And really, Marx was also an industrial thinker. If Marxism won, we would have had industrial communism instead of industrial capitalism, right? So Morton's trying to revive Marx in this in a way that interprets solidarity as solidarity not just with other human beings but with non-humans as well. And then we're going to read Bruno Latour, his book Facing Gaia, where he tries to articulate a political theology, which is something that modern people have tended to not just shy away from, but kind of violently critique. He's resuscitating political theology, but where the God in question that's relevant to our political organization is Gaia. And he's calling for a new form of political organization that would welcome into our Congress, into our parliaments, human representatives for rivers, for forests, so that the interests of Gaia, and for him, Gaia is not one unified goddess. Gaia is a multitude of creatures and systems that interact in this way that's quite fragile. It could break down at any moment, but that for a few billion years at least has found itself organized in a way to provide for the possibility of our lives, and that we're threatening our activity, our industrial activity is threatening Gaia's continued existence, at least for large, complex mammals such as ourselves. So he, with a great deal of urgency, is trying to invite us into a new way of doing politics that includes non-humans. So I hope I have a few minutes. 1 minute, one question. Yeah. Thanks for participating in my ramble. Sean.
I won't bring up Hegel. We'll save that for later.
Don't even mention him.
Except for my disappointment. But anyway. Couldn't get away with it. No. Because he knows better. But anyway.
I didn't mention Hegel.
Yes, you did.
Anyway. You know how aligned we are politically, spiritually, emotionally, etc., etc. And even on the need for the kind of pluralistic injection that you're talking about. But at times in your presentation, I get a little worried. I mean, I wonder to what extent this approach, at least sometimes when I hear you presenting it, could, however unwittingly, be a slippery slope toward alternative facts. I find it hard to accept the idea that there isn't, pragmatically speaking, there is a single reality. It's our planet, our Earth community, right? And at so many levels, I see that there is a commons. There is a shared genetic heritage, et cetera, so many ways of looking at it that sometimes when I hear you talking about the pluriverse, it seems ethically and politically maybe unwise to me, if not just simply not true. That's my perspective. So.
Yeah. So the idea of reality being made of multiple perspectives, it's the idea that there are multiple worlds, but these worlds more or less overlap, depending on the specific cases you're talking about. No world is complete. Every world is incomplete and thus open to being penetrated by other worlds or overlapping with other worlds. Sure. And these worlds are constantly being constructed. They have to be achieved again and again in each moment. They're fragile. Every world is fragile. And so the ethics of pluralism has to do with an increasing awareness of the way that I cannot be aware of all the other worlds that my existence tramples on as I move through my life. But being an ethical person means always striving to become more aware. And that's the challenge of politics in this expanded sense of including non-humans in our sense of what it means to be part of a society. And it's an ongoing task that will never be completed. And in terms of alternative facts, I think, and Latour has done a lot of work on this, trying to work with scientists to communicate in a more effective way about what it is that they do. Facts are always constructed, right? And you need huge laboratories and measuring instruments. And the fact that we have an understanding of climate change is a tremendous achievement that requires satellites and thermometers and at every altitude. And it's a worldwide project that's strung together by these various forms of sensors that are taking readings. And that all has to be brought together with supercomputers to generate these models, and it's a huge collaborative effort that requires a lot of funding and a lot of emails. Latour likes to joke about ClimateGate, where this group of scientists' email server was hacked. Do you remember this? And everyone was seeing that, oh my God, scientists send emails and talk about how to interpret the data. It's like, who knew? But yeah, facts are constructed. And scientists should be open about that. But who better to construct robust facts than this global community of scientists that have been trained and are experts and have the access to the technologies, the measuring instruments that would provide them with the capacity to construct facts. If you compare that community to what like the Heritage Foundation or one of these other climate change denying organizations is doing, they don't have that infrastructure, and so their facts shouldn't be taken as seriously. They're so-called facts. But to deny that facts are in some sense made, yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't deny that.
Yeah.
Anyway, to be continued.
Always.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.